If God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good, why do we live in a world that is blood soaked, where there's so much animal pain and suffering and death? I'm joined today by Dr. Kyle Keltz to help answer that question. Dr. Keltz is a Christian scholar. He has a PhD in the philosophy of religion. He also currently teaches philosophy and English at the college level. And he has written a book called Thomism and the Problem of Animal Suffering, which is a book that represents his work, his PhD work, his dissertation work on the problem of animal pain and suffering. So I can't think of a better person to help us unpack this challenging question. Kyle, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You know, let's start off first with this question. Why is the problem of animal death and pain and suffering such a big challenge for the Christian faith?
Yeah, well, I think, people who are more science-minded especially, and also animal lovers, and there's a lot out there, this becomes an issue for them, not only for Christians, but for non-believers, because, and the problem of animal suffering is this idea that if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, then you wouldn't think that there's going to be animal suffering and disease and death.
He wouldn't create a world where that's present.
Right. I'll admit, if in isolation, if someone asked me, what kind of a world do you think an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God would create, my first guess probably wouldn't be it would include animal suffering, disease, and death. But yes, that's the problem of animal suffering, is reconciling the, because when we look in the natural history of the earth, it looks like animals have been getting sick and dying and suffering for millions of years before humans even got here. And that's what a lot of atheists have issues with, is they think that if God was all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, he wouldn't use millions of years of animal suffering, disease, and death just to make a place for humans to live. So there does seem to really be some tension between animal suffering and God's goodness and power and knowledge.
Yeah, so part of the problem of evil, in a sense, in a very emotionally charged problem. So how can we resolve this tension? What is the response from a Christian perspective to this aspect of the problem of evil?
Okay, yeah, and that's when you really get into thinking into it and looking out in the world and trying to come up with some answers. And there's a couple things that I like to mention up front. I think we'll talk about how animals experience the world here in a second. But one thing that I think a lot of people forget is that pain is a blessing in this world. If animals didn't feel pain, they wouldn't last very long. I've read about children who are born with something called a genetic insensitivity to pain. Mm-hmm. And what happens is they're born, they can't feel pain at all. And they found that with that congenital disease, they usually don't make it past 3 years, and most of them don't make it past being a toddler. Mm. There's so many issues that can happen if you don't feel pain. You won't make it that long. In fact, they found that even if you don't shift in your chair every once in a while, it can cause some major issues really quickly. So pain is actually some good thing that seems to be built into conscious creatures to keep us alive. But also, and you and I have talked about this before, is that studies have found that things like animal predation, animals preying on each other and eating each other, they found that animal predation is actually something that helps the ecosystem, right? They've discovered that, say, like wolves, we were talking about this the other day, wolves and moose. The wolves prey on the moose population, and what happens is they end up eating the weakest, right? Like the youngest, the oldest, and what happens is the ones with genetic disorders get weeded out, and it actually makes the moose population more healthy.
Right.
And it also prevents them from overpopulation. Right. And overpopulation of a prey population can reduce vegetation in an area. Mm-hmm. Basically, they end up starving to death. But also, if one prey population gets bigger, sometimes it makes another prey population that's not as strong. They all die out. So almost paradoxically, animal predation reduces suffering in the animal kingdom.
You know, and something that is interesting to me along these lines when we talk about the idea that there's a benefit to pain, and of course, you want that pain to create discomfort. You want it to be unpleasant because that's what forces you to do something to remedy the pain, right?
Yes.
If it was a different type of sensation, then it wouldn't serve that purpose. But you know, to me, how do you quantify if suffering that an animal is experiencing is excessive, right? Or is it if it's the just right amount? I don't know how anyone could quantify that, let alone make the assertion that the suffering seems to be excessive or needless suffering, right?
Right. Yeah, and you brought up a great point, is that even the unpleasantness of pain we think is necessary to actually get us to avoid actions and things that will hurt us. They did some studies in India with leprosy patients, and what happens is those type of people with that they lose feeling in some of their limbs over time, and they were doing studies to see. Well, they were trying to get them back to work. Actually, it was a study trying to figure out how to get them back to work and get on with their life, and they were when they would do manual labor, they could do all sorts of things that would hurt themselves because they can't feel pain. So they tried like hooking up a light to them. If they applied too much pressure, it would show a light. And I mean, we're talking about humans here. Now, this is a little bit different from animals, but they found that they wouldn't. If you don't feel pain, you're more function oriented. You're just going to get what you want done. Mm-hmm. But if you can feel pain, you're more self-oriented. So the light would come on, and they didn't really care. They would just keep working. These researchers found that the only thing that could really get people to stop from doing the things that were going to hurt them, they eventually had to hook up a electrical shock to it. Mm-hmm. So when the workers would put too much pressure, maybe doing some manual labor, it would shock them. Mm-hmm. But even then, they would just take the device off and then do the work. So they really think that pain, the unpleasantness of pain is actually necessary. And you also brought up another good point, is that we're talking about, if you want to say that it looks like animals are suffering too much, I mean, you don't want to be too impersonal or not have empathy, but it is a subjective experience. Right. So it is hard to make that conclusion that this is too much suffering here or there.
Right. Now, we've been talking about animal suffering, and you made the comment that, you know, you were contrasting, you know, humans experiencing pain versus animals. So how do animals experience pain? Do they experience pain perhaps differently than humans experience pain?
I would say yes and no, right? You know, so we bring up these points that it does look like pain has these benefits, but it's still not a good thing. Like, nobody wants to feel pain, right? So that's when it's really important to try to step back and take a look at what we think is actually happening within the animals when they're experiencing pain. And I think one of the most important things to focus on is that we don't think that animals are self-aware. A really interesting thing from the study of animal cognition is a concept, a distinction that researchers make between what's called episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memory is well, let's say semantic memory. This is just memory of facts about the world, you know, like maybe your home address or something. But episodic memory is actually a personal memories, where you remember yourself in the world in the past. And they've done studies that suggest that animals don't have episodic memory. They can't remember themselves in the past. And other studies into humans has found that we think that episodic memory is tied into being able to do what we call mental time travel. There was a patient in a study who had some, I believe, like brain damage. They called him KC. And KC, something happened to him. I think he got into an accident or something. And he lost the ability, he lost his episodic memory. It was so fascinating. They could ask him, he knew his address growing up. He knew, he could even describe the house to you. But if you asked him what happened in his house growing up, he couldn't tell you a single thing. And in fact, they thought it was also tied into his ability to picture himself in the future. If you said, "Hey, KC, what are you doing later on today?" He said, I don't know. He just said it was blank. So they think that if you don't have episodic memory, you're not able to do what we call mental time travel, which is to remember yourself as a person in the past or think of yourself in the future. And so we think this is what's happening in animals. Other researchers have talked about something called autonoetic awareness, which is just kind of this personal awareness that we think that human beings have, but animals do not. So the implications, what that has for suffering is that, we don't want to deny that animals are conscious, right? It seems to be obvious that they are. Right. They are conscious of the world. So we would probably have that in common with animals. So they are going to be conscious of pain, but they're not going to have this, if you think about, if they can't mental time travel, they can't remember themselves in the past having been in pain personally, and they're not going to be worrying about being in pain in the future because they can't mental time travel, but also they just don't have this personal awareness. And we think this is tied in a lot into self-awareness, but what it all boils down to is that the animals do suffer, but there is no person in the animal kingdom who is thinking, "Ouch, I'm in pain. I wish this wasn't happening to me."
Right.
And I try to tell people, it might sound absurd what I'm trying to say, but the problem is whenever you think about what it is like to be an animal, you're casting your autonoetic awareness upon this idea of what it's like to be an animal. So when you're thinking about it, there's almost like this intrinsic personal aspect of these thinking about it that makes it almost maybe impossible to imagine what it's actually like to be an animal that's suffering. And we've talked about this before. I think one of the best ways to maybe explain it is to just talk about, if you've ever driven to work and you drive to work and you pull up to the office and you think to yourself, I don't really remember how I got here. And then when you think back what had happened, you were thinking about something else, right? Like, what am I doing later on? Did I put the garage door down? Well, but during that time, your body was reacting to the road. You were changing lanes, pressing on the brake, pressing on the gas, but your awareness was somewhere else. And it's almost as if none of that stuff ever happened to you because you don't remember it. So if it's at all possible to even imagine what it's like for an animal to suffer, I think it would be more like that part of you that was reacting to the road rather than the part of you that was aware of what you were thinking about.
Right. Okay, one final question, and we'll wrap up this fascinating conversation. So oftentimes when we think about the problem of evil, and in this case, the problem of animal pain and suffering, we think about God in philosophical terms. How does the complexion of this challenge change, or how does the complexion of our response to the challenge change when we think about God biblically?
Oh yeah, that's great, and I think it guides us closer to good answers in the first place. I think paying attention to what the Bible has to say about God and animals helps you frame or gives you a guide as to where you should be looking when you're looking at the evidence. Because you read the Bible. I know Genesis 1 talks about God creating animals, and it mentions livestock, right? and in Genesis, moving forward, whenever God, after the flood, God tells humanity that they can now eat animals.
Right.
So it seems like it's not a hard conclusion to conclude that God made animals for our benefit. So they're like a means to an end. He's not making animals for their own sake so they can flourish as individuals. Right. He's making them more for man than for themselves. But also animal predation, when we've talked about this, in the Psalms, it talks about how God gives the lions their prey. And this is the psalmist writing a praise psalm about creation, and he would be writing it post-fall, right? Yeah. So, but he's making it sound like it's a good thing for lions to be eating their prey. Yeah. So I just think that when we think biblically about it, we just need to realize that it seems like animal death is not necessarily this evil that God ought to avoid. It seems like it's a good thing, at least from our perspective, because God made animals for us more than he made them for themselves. Right. So it just helps you, because I really think this idea, we just need to be careful, because I think this idea that animal suffering, disease, and death is this evil that a good God would avoid doing is more of a Gnostic leaning type idea, to think that the world is this evil place, when it seems like the psalmist is saying that animal death is a good thing that God uses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, as we were discussing, just a few minutes ago, if it isn't for animal death, then really ecosystems aren't going to thrive. So you could argue that death is necessary for life to be possible. And, if you think about God, the creator, is also God, the redeemer, then you would think that there are going to be redemptive analogies within the creation. And this theme of life being only possible because of death is the heart of the gospel too, right? And so this idea that, again, God creates a world where there is animal death, but that animal death has a very critical purpose, just seems to cohere with the nature of God that we see, in the gospel as well.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Kyle, for being here with us and talking about this really challenging and difficult topic. If you want to know more about Kyle Keltz and the work that he does, you can go to our website, reasons.org, and search for Kyle Keltz, and you'll get information about the types of resources that Kyle has produced for Reasons to Believe, and then also for his own personal ministry.